All right, what's going on, everyone? Let's take a look at some updates around the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. We've got an operational picture. We'll look at essentially battlefield updates across the Gaza Strip, turned down to the Houthis in Yemen, who are back in the news after being on the receiving end of U.S. and U.K. airstrikes in the last couple days. And then U.S. President Biden laid out a ceasefire proposal to end the war in Gaza. We'll talk about what we know about that plan so far. Now, starting with the operational update here, turning to a map to give you an idea of the areas we're going to be talking about. Overview here of Israel. This is live UA map, publicly available resource. We're going to be zooming in here to the Gaza Strip. Most of the updates today are going to be in Rafah, the southern portion of the Gaza Strip down here. But I want to start up further north in Jabalia. So Jabalia is an area that the IDF moved around for the most part in the early days of the war. Did not necessarily clear this entire area, although I do believe there were some raids into the Jabalia camp and quite a bit of fighting on the outskirts of this area. Very dense urban terrain here. Some of the most dense urban terrain in all of Gaza. So it's a very challenging operating environment. Now, Israel just said yesterday that they had completed a 3-month operation in Jabalia and withdrawn in order to prepare for their next mission. They said that Hamas had turned this area into a fortified combat complex where they fired at Israeli forces from shelters and schools and established underground infrastructure in civilian buildings. During the course of this operation, Israel says that they carried out more than 200 airstrikes in Jabalia alone. It's a lot of strikes in a small area where they killed between 500 and 600 Hamas militants, including a battalion commander. Israel added that during the course of these operations, they, of course, secured numerous weapons locations, ammunition, IEDs, rockets, manufacturing sites for weapons, tunnel entrances, and networks, as well as recovering the bodies of 7 hostages that were killed and abducted by Hamas on October 7th. Now, a couple key notes around this Jabalia operation. We're starting to see this more and more where Israel moves in and out relatively quickly. In this case, it looks like about 3 weeks. They push in kind of a raid plus, if you will, to conduct operations for a period of time, clear out as much of that territory, recover hostages when they can, and then move back out to move into future areas down the road. That is likely due to just the size of the Israeli military. They don't have the force structure to fully occupy all of Gaza with their activated military components right now. So they have to kind of pick and choose where they're going to push forces into. And right now, of course, there's increased concern of any sort of escalation on the northern front. So Israel has troops there. They're rotating troops through Rafah, where there's significant combat operations. And then there's other portions, kind of stability operations, if you will, across the Gaza Strip. Quite frankly, the IDF doesn't necessarily have the manpower to be able to push into all areas of the Gaza Strip at all times. So this 2, 3, 4 week raid type clear out areas is probably what we can expect for a little while here. Now, in Jabalia, Israel uncovered quite a few tunnel networks, which shouldn't be surprising. These weren't missed the first time they went through, and it's entirely because they didn't clear every area of Jabalia, and it's entirely possible that Hamas militants just hung out in that area as Israel moved through, pushing further south. Now, turning down to Rafah, pull the map back up here to give you an idea of where we're going. Further south here in the Gaza Strip, this is an area that's been in the news, of course, primarily when talking about the Gaza Strip the last few weeks, if not months. The reason for that is as Israel began their military operations, they largely pushed north to south, so a lot of the civilians moved towards Rafah. There's a lot of internally displaced people in this area, as well as what is believed to be a lot of senior Hamas leaders, as well as if there's any remaining active Hamas battalions, it's likely that a couple of them at least are in Rafah, and then, of course, the hostages. As Israel moves across the Gaza Strip, it's widely believed that the hostages either were initially moved to Rafah or moved there as operations pushed further south. Now, some updates coming from the Rafah area. Israel says that Hamas fired an anti-tank missile from a UNRWA school, and a booby-trapped tunnel shaft inside of a clinic in Rafah detonated, killing 3 Israeli soldiers. So in response to this anti-tank missile that was fired from a UNRWA school, IDF forces moved into this school complex. We have an overhead graphic of what this looks like here, with a mosque and a medical clinic also located inside. So, of course, clearly humanitarian structures, areas that militaries would not go into until they were fired upon and they were turned into a active combat zone by enemy forces, in this case by Hamas. Israel says that during the sweep and clear operation of the medical clinic, 2 incidents of booby-trapped IEDs went off, detonating while the troops were inside. As a result of those explosions, 3 Israeli soldiers were killed. As Israel continued to clear this facility, they said they found large quantities of weapons stored in the school and classrooms, including firearms, grenades, and then tunnel shafts leading from these humanitarian facilities, schools, clinics, and mosques, leading down underground, connecting to larger Hamas networks. Additionally, and pulling back up the map here, Israel said on Wednesday that they had achieved operational control of the Philadelphia corridor, this area that runs right along the Gaza border with Egypt. And they said this is an area where the IDF, if they're not physically present right now, they have surveillance means to watch this entire area, again, outlined in blue here on the map. Now, during the course of this clearance operation, there were some pretty significant finds by Israel. First and foremost, on everyone's mind, the tunnel networks, right? So Israel says they uncovered at least 20 tunnels connecting Gaza to Egypt across this border, underneath this border area, with 80 more that they've identified but have not yet fully investigated. So the concern here with the tunnels is real anything moving back and forth from Egypt to Gaza, right? Israel thinks they've got Gaza locked down, and that Hamas and the hostages are there and that weapons cannot get in. These tunnels tell a different story. It leads to speculation that senior Hamas leadership may have exited Gaza, right? They couldn't get through the border crossings, but they can go underground. Concern that hostages may have been moved outside of Gaza to where Israel likely is not going to be able to recover them, especially during the course of this war. And then, of course, the concern that weapons are being moved from Egypt, smuggled from Egypt, starting from Egypt, I should say, not as though they're necessarily coming from Egypt themselves, but the smuggling route starting in Egypt, moving into Gaza. Now, the existence of these tunnels isn't anything new, shouldn't be shocking. This has largely been how Hamas has supplied the Gaza Strip for a long time with illicit materials, especially weapons, but we've also seen some humanitarian type supplies moving through there as well that is then sold on the black market. Now, Egypt in recent years has made efforts to shut down, or it's looked like, to shut down these tunnel networks, destroy a handful of them. The existence of more tunnels being used, and Israel says that they engaged Hamas militants in some of these tunnel networks that were connected to Egypt, which suggests that they're still very, very active. Now, these tunnel finds, which should not be a shock to anybody, again, do bring about some interesting speculation, which is speculation. Again, hammer that home. So bear with me because you got to connect like 4 or 5 dots to make this a story, but I think it's at least worth bringing up because it's possible that we head that route. And one of the reasons why this could become such a big story. So on the one hand, you could say Egypt is not capable of dealing with these tunnels, which would be interesting because they have been in the past. And you have to think that as this war kicked off, there would be increased focus on shutting down, identifying these tunnels to make sure that Egypt isn't viewed as some sort of complicit in the ongoing war that's playing out in Gaza, right? On the other hand, this is where the speculation comes in. There's the possibility that powerful people in Egypt, be it political, military, or other, don't have a desire to close these down, which maybe they're on the receiving end. They're able to get a cut of this illicit activity, these black market goods, be it weapons, food, or anything else, or personnel being moved across the border. That is one of the arguments being made as to why these tunnels still operate. Again, to hammer home, that is speculation that has not been proven at this point, but it's one of the reasons that the existence and these tunnel finds are the story that they've become. Then turning down to the Houthis in Yemen, who are a part of this war because they say that they are carrying out these attempted strikes on commercial and military vessels in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and that they will stop these strikes as soon as the siege of Gaza is lifted and humanitarian aid is brought in. Now, I want to be clear that these attempted strikes and successful strikes at times by the Houthis hasn't really stopped. Since they began this back in, I want to say, November, December, shortly after the war kicked off, they haven't stopped. There's been peaks and valleys at different times, but the Houthis have been relatively consistent in their targeting of shipping. Now, just a couple days ago, the U.S. and U.K. carried out a wave of airstrikes into Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen, which, according to the Houthis, killed 16 and wounded 41 more, which is the highest publicly acknowledged death toll from the wave of U.S. and U.K. strikes so far, which I believe is either 4 or 5 at this point. Now, in response to this, the Houthis put out a statement saying that they carried out a military operation against the USS Eisenhower, an aircraft carrier that is launching some of the aircraft being used to conduct strikes inside of Yemen. They say the hit was accurate and direct, and this was circulating all across the internet yesterday. A lot of people went to the Houthis, took their word as truth and said, hey, looks like the Eisenhower has been hit, might be sinking, and kind of extrapolated out from there. There's no evidence that the Eisenhower was hit. There were more incidents of drones and anti-ship ballistic missiles being shot down in the last couple days, but there's nothing, no pictures, no videos, nothing to suggest that the Eisenhower was successfully targeted or even had anything shot down in their near vicinity. Now, I do want to add that a couple days ago, the Houthis released additional footage showing that they shot down another U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone over Yemen. Now the Houthis, they're doing a pretty good job of actually showing the video evidence of this stuff, right? So as opposed to the claim that they struck the Eisenhower, which was just, trust me, we said it happened, they're actually putting out videos of the interception and then the downed Reaper aircraft over and over again. This is, according to the Houthis, the 6th Reaper that they've shot down. I think that's going back a few years, though. In terms of this recent conflict since the November-December timeframe, I want to say this is number 4 that they have successfully intercepted and shot down. Then in pretty big news yesterday, U.S. President Biden laid out a ceasefire proposal to end the war in Gaza, saying, quote, it's time for this war to end and for the day after to begin. And he added some pretty interesting comments here, and then we'll dive into kind of the focus of this ceasefire agreement. He said that Israel has devastated Hamas's forces over the past 8 months, saying at this point, Hamas is no longer capable of carrying out another October 7th, which I feel like can be viewed a lot of different ways. It's entirely possible that, a couple days after this attack took place, you could say they're not capable of doing it again because Israel would be on increased security alert, right? Really watching for this type of thing to happen. You could also extrapolate this all the way out to say they're not capable of doing this because their entire military force has been destroyed, which we know that's not the case. So it's somewhere in between. But the interesting aspect here, the kind of signaling, the messaging coming from President Biden is telling Israel, hey, from our point of view here in the United States, one of your wartime objectives has been met. Remember, one of the key objectives is the destruction of Hamas or preventing them from carrying anything out like this in the future. So this is President Biden outright saying, hey, one of those objectives is met. Let's talk peace. He said, quote, I know there are those in Israel who will not agree with this plan and will call for the war to continue indefinitely. Some are even in the governing coalition. They've made it clear that they want to occupy Gaza. They want to keep fighting for years, and the hostages are not a priority to them. That was pretty extreme language, if you think about it. Telling leaders of another government that from our perspective, your citizens being held as hostages are not a priority to you. I haven't seen the heated responses to that yet, but you got to think they're coming as the day goes on here. Now, jumping into the meat and potatoes of this ceasefire agreement, which is not drastically different than those we've seen in the past. A big argument here is that there's a few reasons this is being pushed forward. One, people are tying this to, of course, the U.S. election. President Biden wants this to get somewhat wrapped up before the debates start and we start to head to the polls here in a few months. There's also an argument that this has to do with the recent Israeli strike in Rafah, targeting 2 senior Hamas leaders, but also led to what appears to, at this point, have triggered secondary detonations with Hamas rockets in the area, killing 40-plus Palestinians in the process. That triggered international outrage. We saw it spreading all across social media. There's an argument that brought additional pressure to Biden to try to wrap this thing up. And then there's the last piece here that Hamas has been so successfully degraded by Israel at this point that finally the opening is there to where they might be willing to accept some sort of ceasefire. Take it for what it's worth. Those are a couple different avenues that people are presenting as to why now, this time, this ceasefire agreement might actually go through. Now, according to this plan, during the first phase, the ceasefire will last for 6 weeks. Israeli forces would withdraw from the Gaza population centers, and hostages, including the elderly and women, would be exchanged for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Palestinian civilians would return to Gaza, including northern Gaza, and 600 trucks would bring humanitarian aid into Gaza each day. Then in the second phase, Hamas and Israel would negotiate terms of a permanent end to hostilities, with President Biden saying here the ceasefire will still continue as long as negotiations continue. And then the third phase would really focus on a major reconstruction plan for Gaza. So again, nothing groundbreaking here really, right? You're talking about the release of hostages and Palestinian prisoners being held by Israel. Then you're talking about finding a complete and total end to hostilities, and then the reconstruction of Gaza. It's kind of what we've seen from the very early days of any sort of negotiations here. I'm seeing some optimism come out that this could go through, but we'll have to wait and see. Now, one of the optimistic parties here is Hamas, who put out a statement yesterday saying that they positively viewed what was included in the speech of U.S. President Joe Biden for his call to a permanent ceasefire for the Israeli forces' withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, the reconstruction of Gaza, and the exchange of prisoners. They added that Hamas confirms its readiness to deal positively and in constructive manner with any proposal that is based on the permanent ceasefire and the full withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, full withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip, the reconstruction of Gaza, and the return of the displaced to their places, along with the fulfillment of genuine prisoner swap deal if the occupation clearly announces commitment to such deal. Now, we're going to see a lot of pushback on this shortly, I'm sure. A couple of key components here is that this appears to leave Hamas in power, which for a lot of people in Israel is a deal breaker. Now, it does sound like this is a deal that Israel has agreed to, or at least that's what's being presented to this point, and that the deal has made its way through mediators to Hamas. But again, a major component here is that it has Israeli forces completely withdrawing from the Gaza Strip while leaving Hamas in power of the area. I'd be surprised if that's something that Israel is fully on board with, but that's kind of what's being suggested here. So we'll keep an eye on this ceasefire agreement as more details come out. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. Substack's like a mix between a newsletter and a website. We're putting out 3 articles there each week on things that aren't getting what we think as much coverage as they should elsewhere. So discussions about the challenges that China would face if they wanted to invade Taiwan, what's going on with French forces in Caledonia. And then yesterday, talked about the Wagner resurgence in Africa under their newly rebranded entity, the Africa Corps. Of course, I think that stuff's all pretty interesting. If you do, it's linked in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.